Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar on successful attribution, why now and how tomorrow. My name is Emma Del Sarries, and I lead the customer success team for Nielsen attribution products in Europe. I'm very excited to welcome here Johanna Álvarez from Barceló Hotel Group, who has been our partner for the past few years. She will be your guide to understanding the strategic value of marketing attribution, especially in the context of increased scrutiny over the efficiency of media budgets. She will also talk you through the necessary evolution of attribution in light of upcoming changes to the digital ecosystem. Over to you, Johanna.
And hi, everyone. It's such an honor really to be here with you all today. We've been working on, can you hear me?
Slight delay, but go on.
Okay, perfect. So again, it's really an honor to be here with you today. And it's really something that we have been working on for such a long time. So it's a pleasure to be here finally doing this webinar with you. As Emma said, we've been working together for a couple of years now in our partnership with Barceló Hotel Group. And ever since we met, all the things related to cookies have been an interest of mine and also of hers. So we've had lots of conversations around this topic. And now what we want to do is share that information with you and all the knowledge that I've been able to acquire these past couple of months, specifically with regards to how Nielsen is approaching this new scenario in which third-party cookies are coming to an end. The webinar is also going to be focused on the value that an attribution model, specifically multi-touch attribution model, has for a company. So there are a couple of things that I want to share with you with regards to the webinar. The first one is that because of some issues that I've been having with my internet connection, we had to record the session previously. So the main part of the session is going to be recorded and you are going to be seeing a video that I did previously. But after that, I'm going to come back again live and we are going to be answering the Q&A session. Apart from that, what I wanted to do is to encourage you all. I need to take or to make use of this time that we have together now to ask all the questions that you have in mind regarding this topic and to use that chat box that we have there to ask all the things that might be coming to your mind as I speak and as I share information with you through that video. And we'll be answering those questions and addressing those questions at the end of the webinar or afterwards if we run out of time. I believe I'm not leaving. Oh yeah, one important piece. The whole session is going to be sent out to you, recorded after the webinar. So just bear in mind that we're going to have a video also after the session. And without further ado, let me share the video with you. We are going to start playing that video with you now. And I hope you enjoy it and you find it useful. And that's it. Let's go for it.
Hey again, everyone. Moving on to the webinar itself, the very first thing that I like to address is the conclusion. And I like to start with that because I consider it is very important for you to know what are the 5 things that you are going to live with once the webinar is over. And the first one is that attribution is one of marketers' allies. The reason why I believe so is because, as you will see throughout the webinar, there are so many insights that we can get from it. And those type of insights can really help us accomplish our business objectives. Now, the second one is that third-party cookies are definitely coming to an end. And even though there have been so many changes over the past couple years related to third-party cookies, the latest one related to this topic is the one that has really made the world understand that third-party cookies are coming to an end. So yes, it's happening and it's meant to happen by 2022. Now, the third point is that there's a new paradigm. What do I mean by this? Well, that there are so many things changing around advertising, and we as marketers need to readapt our business processes and everything that we had in place to be able to be prepared for all those new scenarios that are arising. The fourth one is also related to all these changes around privacy and around third-party cookies. And it's the fact that although attribution modeling relies heavily on that third-party data and those third-party cookies, it is very far from being a thing from the past. Attribution has a very bright future still in front of it, and I'll share with you what's being developed to guarantee that we as marketers have an attribution model, an agnostic one in the future. Now, the fifth one is that there are a couple of things that we can start already doing today to prepare our company for that new scenario in which third-party cookies are no longer available. And the main point here is that first-party cookie is going to be a great substitute for third-party data. Now, without further ado, let's move on to the webinar. And I'm going to be sharing with you my experience, what I've learned through these past 2 years being the main person responsible for attribution modeling in the company that I'm part of, which is Barceló Hotel Group. And I want to share with you how we got to that point in which we realized that we needed an attribution model in our company, and how all things led us to choosing Nielsen attribution as that solution. So for me, it all started with us realizing that we had a very complex customer journey, that it didn't take people 1 or 2 interactions with our media to make the decision of buying. It didn't take people 1 or 2 interactions with our media to make the decision to finally buy one of our rooms, but instead our journeys were becoming more and more complex, and we had so many channels involved. And as those journeys grew, we realized that there were so many efforts being put into creating those journeys. We had so many channels involved, and behind those channels there are teams, and there's investment, and there's a whole strategy that's being defined by someone in the company. So of course, what we needed to do was to make sense of that whole process that we had defined around marketing. These numbers right here show that over 58% of our customer journeys have more than 10 interactions in them. That's a lot of data, and really that's a lot of efforts from part of our team, and in terms of investment as well, that we needed to understand if all those complexity was really paying off in terms of more conversions and more revenue for the company. And that's how we came to the conclusion that we needed something that would allow us to understand what was the perfect mix of all those ingredients, of all those channels, to create the most coherent combination of paid and organic channels that would benefit the company, and at the same time that would allow us to be present in all the different points that our customer were trying to search a product and that were showing interest for one of our products. And that's how marketing attribution came into the picture. And as a cooking fan, what I'd like to do here is just to do an analogy between marketing attribution and a cooking robot. I believe that when you are cooking, there are 3 factors that are determinant for the success of the recipe. One of them is the quality of the products that you are putting in. Now, the second one is the quantity of those products. It's definitely not good to put too much of something, because most likely that's going to kill the flavor of other type of products. And the third thing is that you need to take into account the timing. For how long should you leave something cooking so that it's in the perfect temperature, and at the same time the perfect texture. So bringing this or moving this to marketing, the way I see it is that marketing attribution is that cooking robot where we put in all the different channels that we have available, we put in all the data, and with that we are able to know what should be the perfect quantity of each one of those channels based on the impact or based on the effect that they are having in the generation of revenue for the company. At the same time, and speaking of timing, what you are going to be able to do with marketing attribution is to be able to understand, for example, for how long you should be or you should leave your campaigns running so that they are able to reach the maximum point and they are able to generate or to get the maximum visibility to generate the maximum amount of revenue possible. And that's where I see the comparison. It's basically the appliance or the ally that you are going to find in the digital world to be able to know how to cook the perfect recipe in terms of marketing mix. That being said, I'd like to make a hard stop here. And I like to share with you the results of a poll that we recently put together and shared with you on LinkedIn, specifically on the LinkedIn account of the Nielsen team. And one of the things we asked there was, what's the most widely used attribution model in digital marketing? These were the answers. So many people, in fact, said, well, not many people, but some people went for linear. A few more people went for first interaction. Around 20% of those went for a last non-direct click. And finally, 63% of them went for last click. And what I'd like to share with you is that, in fact, the most widely used attribution model is not last click, but rather last non-direct click. And you might be thinking, oh, that non-direct is not really going to make a big difference. Well, the reality is that it definitely does, because when it comes to attribution modeling, details really make the difference. And when I say that this is the most widely used attribution model, I'm referring, for example, or I'm referring specifically to the fact that most companies still use Google Analytics data to attribute their transactions and their revenue. And what you need to know there is that even though most people call that model last click, the default attribution model in Google Analytics is not last click. It's called last non-direct click. And I like to make use of this example right here to show you why is it that details really make the difference in attribution. So if we have a look at this direct conversion over here, what I want to do with you is analyze how each of those different models would end up attributing the transaction. So if we have a look at last non-direct click, the transaction would be attributed to paid search. And I'll explain why in a minute. Now, if we analyze last click, the transaction would be attributed to direct, because it is in fact the last channel available in the journey. But if we were to look into last event, which is the attribution model typically used in an ad server, and we assume that this is an impression, this transaction again would be attributed to paid search. Paid search is not really the final channel or the last interaction in this whole journey. The rules that are defined in this type of models end up generating and end up creating an over attribution of revenue to those typical paid channels, the ones that are lower in the funnel. And again, going back to last non-direct click and answering why this transaction would be attributed to paid search. The reason for that is because last non-direct click takes out of the picture the direct conversion and doesn't take into account the direct channel per se, unless there's no other interaction behind. So this transaction would only end up being attributed to direct if previously there were no channels in the journey. But since there are some previous, and this is an impression, we are assuming, the winning channel is, or the winner is going to be paid search. Well, that being said, and the fact that we realized that there were so many differences among these type of models, we knew that we didn't want our model to be based on rules, and that was it. We knew that we wanted something else, and we started looking for a more complex kind of attribution model. And that model was supposed to take data into account rather than just defining rules. And that model was supposed to make use of statistics and make use of machine learning, for example, and also to modelize data on a day-to-day basis. So we actually started creating that list of items that were fundamental and that were very important for us as a company. These last 2 points were very important for us as well. And the agnosticity part refers to the fact that if you think about it, most attribution models right now, or the ones that we typically tend to use, are provided by the exact same company that we buy advertising from. And it's that idea of having the judge and the party do the exact same job that doesn't make any sense. You know, you cannot be judge and party at the same time. And that's why we knew that agnosticity was very important for us. We wanted something to be completely outside of the picture of advertising and to dedicate purely to measurement, to be the one telling us which channels were performing better than the others. Now, the last one that we wanted to be capable of having was having a continued support. We didn't want just someone implementing the model and leaving us there. We wanted to have a continued support, and the company or the solution that provided us with that was Nielsen Attribution. And that's basically how our worlds united. Okay. And I'd like to share with you what we've gained with this whole thing. And the first thing that we gained were insights. We gained the possibility of really understanding how certain channels that tend to be very undervalued were really performing and were having an impact in the generation of conversions and revenue for the company. And I'd like to share with you that when comparing Nielsen attribution to different models, like for example, last event that also takes impressions into account but prioritizes clicks over impressions, that's the rule. What we realized was that display was having or was being undervalued by 700%. So 700% of the revenue that was supposed to be attributed to display was not being attributed to that channel. And when it came to the other channels, of course, what we were seeing was an over-attribution of revenue. So there were channels, it ranged between 9 to 40%, depending on the channel, of additional revenue. So we knew, or we were able to have a clearer picture of what was the impact of our marketing. But at the same time, and of course, due to those insights, we were able to optimize our marketing investment. And with the type of information that we would get from Nielsen, and in here, I'd like to share something with you, because I'm sure that as a marketer, you've been at this point. You know that many times companies tend to keep things running because they don't have any data to prove if something is working or not. And in our case, what was happening many times is that we kept campaigns running, or we kept keywords running, because in our mind was that we had in our mind that maybe the model that we were using was not being able to attribute a transaction or a conversion to that specific campaign or keyword, but it was assisting conversions. It was, let's say, that higher above in the funnel, and because of that, it was not receiving credit for the transactions. But the good thing once we included or once we put a Nielsen attribution in the middle of everything was that we realized that in fact, many of those campaigns were not being assisting anything. And we were just dedicating investment to many campaigns and keywords and creatives and many things in terms of media activation. And those were not having or generating anything for the company back. And by doing those type of analyses, we were able to save in a year 5% of our investment. Now, 5% might not look like an important number. It's like, yeah, sure, just 5% of your investment. But in the end, it totally depends on the amount of investment that you have available, the total amount. And when I look at these numbers, I just see, or I just start thinking about the quantity or the amount of things that you could do with that saved investment. Because yeah, this is an important distinction. You can either save that money because maybe that's something that your company is asking you for. Maybe your company is asking you to minimize your marketing investment, but at the same time you could even reinvest that money and be able to generate even more revenue with what you've been able to actually put aside and understand that was not generating any revenue with with the actions that you had it before. And that brings me to the new paradigm. The reality is that 2020 is resulting to be a very challenging year, not only for the marketing industry, but for our whole society. Of course, there are so many crazy things going around the world. And what I want to share with you is that that new paradigm is in fact having an effect. And what we've seen is that the pandemic has generated a new paradigm in terms of advertising, in the sense that one, many companies, not all, but many, have less investment available. So there's a lower investment. And at the same time, we are dealing with a more competitive environment. Why, you may ask? Well, because demand is being very weak in many areas. So the fact that we have less demand and the same companies trying to fight for those same audiences and that same demand makes competition basically increase and become more of a challenge for companies. So as you may see here, analyzing the data of Q2, we realized that there was an important decrease, and this is not the regular trend in digital in ad spend. In fact, the most common thing is to see ad spend increasing continuously month after month, year after year. But the pandemic has generated this new scenario in which many companies have seen themselves forced into cutting off their budgets. What's the matter with this? Well, that I really believe that independently on the amount of investment that you have available, marketing attribution is a great tool. But specifically speaking of those companies that are seeing their budgets cut, I believe that really making or taking the efforts to optimize every single cent that they have available is fundamental, because less money and more challenges to spend that money, basically. And the next thing that I like to share with you in terms of challenges is that privacy has been a topic of interest for the past couple of years for many people. And I happen to be one of those people. I really enjoy everything related to privacy because I believe there really needs to be regulations around the way data is used. But not only that, I also believe that there's lots of misinformation around privacy, and there's lots of disconnection between the user and the companies that use the data, and users don't really get to understand what privacy is about. So I believe that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that side. But independently of that, what has been happening recently is that many companies, and not only companies, but also lawmakers, have been shifting towards a more privacy-centric approach. So starting with GDPR back in May 2018, that helped make many people aware of what cookies were, and also make many companies aware of the fact that they needed to be more transparent with their users. But then came September 2018, and in September 2018, let's say that we started seeing the very first important movements in browsers towards a more privacy-centric approach. And Safari was the first one doing this. And with ITP2, they cut access to third-party cookies. And then came Firefox. And more recently, we had Chrome join that party of the browsers, the privacy-centric browser. Now, good news is that Chrome plans on shutting support to third-party cookies by 2022. So let's say that they've given the industry a margin of 2 years to adapt. One thing that I'd like to mention here is that even though this has been happening for a couple of years already, nothing was really happening, or there was not a real concern around the topic, because Safari and Firefox tend to have quite a low market share. Of course, it totally depends on the country that you are analyzing and the industry that you are in. But when it comes to Chrome, what you see is that Chrome has over 60% more or less of market share. So having that in mind and uniting these three, what we come to is a scenario in which almost 100% of the data, or almost 100% of third-party cookies, are going to be gone. So that's where the real concerns arise. That's where the whole industry starts talking about the cookie apocalypse, and the end of many platforms, and the end of many solutions that depend also on third-party cookies. And I like to make use of this graph to show you why third-party cookies are important when speaking of measurement. And right here, what you are seeing is how conversions and revenue have evolved or were collected in Campaign Manager and Google Analytics on our end throughout 2018 and 2019. And as I mentioned, there was an important change in September 2018. So what we see here is that from September onwards, there starts being a gap between Google Analytics and Campaign Manager. Specifically, Campaign Manager starts losing track of some part of the revenue that gets generated, and some part of the revenue that Google Analytics does collect. So what happened in that part was that ITP2 was released. What's the difference between those two platforms? Well, that Campaign Manager relies on third-party cookies to stitch a conversion back to a click or an impression. Now, Google Analytics, on the other hand, uses first-party cookies. So what happens with this is that, or my conclusion, is that not having third-party cookies, what's going to generate is this exact a scenario, or this exact situation in which companies don't have the capabilities of understanding how a certain conversion is attached or linked to previous interactions that the user had with our media. And we start seeing those gaps, basically. And of course, this takes me to the common idea that many of us have or had in mind at some point, which is that attribution is under threat. And of course, it is normal, because not having that third-party cookie is going to decrease the capability of attribution for doing cross-device attribution. And at the same time, it's going to increase the number of unattributed transactions, which is exactly what I just mentioned. Unattributed transactions are those conversions or revenue that you cannot link to previous activity. What this is going to lead to is to having less accuracy in your platforms. And of course, you don't want to use And of course, you don't want to use data that's not accurate to make decisions. And does it mean then that we have to give up on attribution? I don't believe so. I really don't think so. And because of that, well, since I don't think so, and I see attribution as a very fundamental part of marketing, I also asked the Nielsen team to be able to share a poll with people in which they would say what they would save in a scenario in which they could be able to keep one of these solutions intact. So we put together another poll, again published it on the LinkedIn account of Nielsen, and what we saw was that many people also agreed that attribution modeling is important, and they preferred saving attribution models over DMPs and over retargeting. And as you may see here, it is kind of a balance between DMPs and retargeting. Sorry. And as you may see here, it is kind of balance between attribution models and DMPs. But the most important part in the end is that even though as marketers, we understand that it is important to activate the data and to make use of that data in a first, second, and third party scenario and so forth, the most important part for many of us ends up being able to really understand how each one of those efforts that we are putting into our marketing strategy is having an effect in conversions. And that's where attribution models come into play. So this takes me sort of to the future of attribution. And to share with you what the future of attribution looks like, I want to talk about a talk from Lana Busignani. And in that talk that I saw from her, Lana is one of Nielsen's leaders. And she was mentioning that attribution needs to grow up. I couldn't agree more because I really saw why she meant that. And I want to share with you the story of how cookies were created in the first place. Cookies back in the day were created by a company called Netscape. Cookies the way we know them today. So they were created by this company called Netscape back in 1994. And they were created because there was another company called MCI that was looking into being able to save the products that their users wanted to add into the shopping cart. But instead of saving all those products and all that information on their end, they wanted to be able to store that information on the client side and to be able to be more efficient with processing and storing that data. So they asked Netscape to be able to have something that would allow them to store that information in the browser that Netscape was also developing. And they came up with the idea of using magic cookies, which were already being used, as the token that would allow them to save that information and to store that information in the browser. What I mean by this is that in the end, cookies were born with the first party component in mind. They were born to solve an issue related to something that was meant to be covered or that was meant to be kept at a first party environment. And all of a sudden, a whole industry, the ad tech industry, the advertising industry has been developed over a cookie, over a component that was not even designed in first place for us. So that's why I really see why Lana mentioned this idea of attribution growing up. We basically need to find new ways of being able to measure in a privacy compliant way, but at the same time measuring with different types of data that make the model robust, but at the same time running away from those type of things that just create dependencies in this whole scenario. And that takes me to why the current model is failing. And for me, the current model fails because there are too many intermediaries in the process. But let's say that not all those intermediaries are going to disappear in the future scenario. The most important one is this one right here. And the dependency that we have created over browsers to be able to stitch or to unite the data that advertisers and publishers collect. So with that data, what we do is that we use third-party cookies to be able to understand those two worlds and to unite those two worlds. So what we basically need to do is to get rid of those and start thinking more on direct integrations between the solutions that we want to feed with data and the direct providers of that data. And one thing that we need to take into account is that in the end, advertisers and publishers already collect enough information, and a good part of that information is associated with a unique identifier. So those unique identifiers are going to be substituting the third-party cookies. The idea here is basically to have things like emails, like phone numbers, like first-party cookies acting as substitutes of first-party cookies. And that, in fact, is how the future looks like. And that, in fact, is how the future looks like. Having conversations with the Nielsen team, I came to the conclusion that first-party data is going to be king in this new scenario. So we as advertisers or as publishers are going to have to collect as much high-quality data as possible, but not all type of data that's authenticated and that allows us to stitch that information between these two without the need of having a third-party cookie. Not only that, but walled gardens are also going to play a key role in this whole scenario. And what do I mean by walled gardens, or what's the definition of a walled garden? A walled garden is basically a company that has enough power in the market to choose what to do with the data that's collected within their platform. One example is Google. And from my perspective, all the changes that Google has been doing recently basically point towards a change towards a walled garden. And they are going to be the ones choosing who's going to access the data and at which granularity. But independently of that, these are going to be fundamental to uniting that information with the data of publishers, independent publishers, and advertisers, and to building sort of a very holistic view of what users do before they purchase. And with that, attribution models like the one we are talking about right now, which is Nielsen attribution, are going to be able to understand how media is having an effect in conversions. Now, let's move on to what could you do to start preparing, and what can you do now to prepare your company for the future. So the very first thing that I'd say is you can define. The second one is going to be to increase. And the third one is going to be to prioritize. Well, the first one is to define your data collection strategy, and basically to define how, where, and what type of information you are going to collect from your users. The second one is to increase the volume of logged users that you have. And by that, I'm not really referring to, and by that, what I'm referring to is to generating impact, to generating value to your customers via, for example, a loyalty program, via content marketing, via all sorts of things that can be done within your website. Maybe, and one thing that I tend to think a lot about is privatizing everything that can be privatized within your website. For example, if you have an offer section within your website, why should you leave it open and look like the company that always offers an offer? Well, instead, you can just make that private and give access just to members. And by doing that, what you're going to do, of course, is to, let's say that to incentivize people to share information with you, because in exchange, they are getting something. And the third thing, and for me, the most important one, is that we cannot forget that all these things are happening because there's an increasing concern around privacy. So whatever it is that we do to collect more data, to increase the volume of logged users, we need to keep in mind that we need to be transparent with our users, and we need to keep privacy in mind. And that's really fundamental for this whole thing to work the way it needs to work. That brings me to the end of the webinar, and I'd like to address again the conclusions that we mentioned at the beginning. So as we said, attribution is fundamental. It is very important for marketers because of how it helps you optimize your investment, and because of the type of insights that it gives you to understanding the impact that you are generating with your marketing efforts. The second thing is that, yes, third-party cookies are definitely coming to an end. And even though it's strange to think about digital and advertising without third-party cookies, it's definitely happening. The third one is that all the recent challenges that we as a society are experiencing, and also everything related to the privacy, the growing privacy concern, is generating a new paradigm for advertising. And we just basically need to adapt and to rethink the way we are doing things to be prepared for those new types of scenarios. The fourth one, again, attribution has future, and that future lies on the idea of using first-party data as a substitute to third-party data. It is going to be turning around the idea of finding new and more robust ways of stitching information and uniting conversions to previous activity or to previous interactions with media. And the final one is that you need to start now, that you can do many things now to start preparing your data collection strategy with a clear focus on first-party data.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Johanna. I think this was amazing. I hope everyone found the presentation as insightful as I did. And as you can imagine, we have a few questions. So let me start with a few of them. So first one is what are typically the differences that you're seeing between last click and multi-touch attribution? Or like another way of asking it would be, how does it affect your strategic planning or budgeting across digital media channels?
Okay, so that's an important one, Emma, because as I touched on the webinar, let's say that the details in attribution modeling make the difference. And when it comes to multi-touch attribution modeling, what happens is that you are assigning like partial credit to all the channels that participate in the path to conversion, which for me is like the biggest difference with respect to what you do with other type of models, which, as I was saying also during the webinar, tend to attribute conversions just based on a single rule, and attribute 100% of a conversion to a single channel in a path that keeps increasing and increasing, and that keeps being more complicated as time goes by. So I believe that that's one of the biggest difference, like the fact that more channels in our path start getting conversions attributed for what they do or how they impact that path to conversion. One of the typical numbers or the biggest changes that we see also is that since last event, last click, these type of models tend to look just as at the lower or at the channels that are lower in the funnel, they kind of forget about everything related to brand awareness and to prospecting and to other type of channels that also have an effect but are not typically seen on a last click model. So in those cases, what we've seen is on the one hand, for display, we saw those increases like, yeah, I mentioned something like around 700% increase on revenue for channels like display. And another one for me that's super useful as well is the fact that we are able to see the effect that impressions in Facebook have in our attribution model, which is something that we don't have in other attribution models, and we do have with Nielsen attribution because of the partnership that you have with them. So I guess that's it in terms of the effects of measuring with one model and the other. But when it comes to how it affects our decision making, I believe that the main effect that we see is that since we now have more information and we have data to support the activity in a upper funnel channels, we basically distribute our investment in a different way. So if before we were to focus much more on a lower funnel channels, we are now distributing that in a different way to keep that cycle kind of rolling and to dedicating more efforts to upper funnel activities.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes perfect sense, and that's very much in line with what we see with other clients. One of the things that you mentioned, obviously, and it links to another question. Obviously, as a marketer or an analyst, a lot of your job is to analyze past data in order to make better decisions for the future. Now, given the current situation, which is so volatile, how does the current situation, how does that impact the tactical execution of your digital marketing, or how did you adapt to it?
I'd say that the way we adapted to it was by changing the way in which we make decisions. I believe it's very typical in the marketing industry to have a look at how things were going last year and to compare ourselves to last year to make decisions this year. And the fact that things change so fast in the current scenario, well, just made us switch that a little bit and start making decisions more in the short term, just analyzing, for example, last week's data, for example, or taking into account like more short-term data to kind of predict or try to understand where was the feeling in that moment in the market. We also moved a lot into trying to analyze real-time data to try and be as connected as possible to our users and to see how they were reacting to political news, to announcements that there were in the news and this type of things. So it was a switch in that sense that we used to look at data from the past to make decisions. And even though we do that as well today, let's say that the look back window is way shorter nowadays.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then obviously I know your business pretty well, and I know that especially because you lead everything from a MarTech perspective, you have implemented a lot of automation in the way that you normally work. Again, has that been affected by the current situation?
Definitely. I mean, our team, which is led by our dear Tony Conde, I'm going to shout out to him right here. He's been doing, he basically had a clear idea when the pandemic hit and when everything started changing so rapidly. And that was that we needed to move from those automated processes and from everything that we had in place to doing more day-by-day analysis and doing more, let's say that the people from our team started putting way more of their thoughts and their understanding of the market to make decisions rather than just leaving the algorithm make the decision for us. It was more of a day-to-day basis analysis to understand how things were evolving, and it was way more manual than it used to be. It was, as you said, very automated, and that changed drastically with what we had with the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely, and I hope we've been good support as much as we could be through this. Thinking about the value that you get from MTA, somebody's asking about, you mentioned 5% of savings as an example of what you've derived from MTA, but can you talk about kind of other ways in which you can derive value from that partnership? It's a bit of a pointed question, but
yeah, I mean, I know that the number sounds small, and that's something that I mentioned also in the webinar. 5% might sound like a very a small percentage, but for me, it's not only about the amount of money that you can spend in marketing investment. It's also a lot about the amount of processes that you can or yeah, the amount of processes in which you can be more efficient with this type of data. Because imagine the type or the amount of campaigns that you can optimize, or that you might as well stop running because you now understand that those campaigns are not generating anything for the company. Also, the frustration for the teams many times, the fact that they do and do and do and have like 1,000 campaigns to run on a year, and then they realize that a good part of those campaigns are not working. So it's also a lot of efficiency on the team side, realizing that that there are some of the things that they are doing that are not generating anything for the company, and they can basically switch or use part of that time to do more useful things for the company and for themselves as well. It's somewhere, let's say that there's a win-win in terms of marketing investment, like saving marketing investment, but at the same time, there's an efficiency in terms of teams and in terms of processes for the company. So yeah, I know it sounds small, but the results go way beyond that number.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely, and I think that efficiency is obviously, as you rightly said so in the presentation, something that is of utmost importance at the moment. I think that 2021 looks like an interesting year. We're not over the pandemic, and obviously there's all of the ecosystem changes that you've talked about. And actually, probably for a closing question, and this one is a little bit of a big question, so apologies in advance, but from your perspective, what other disruptions or changes do you anticipate in the industry by 2022? Or like, you know, what do you think that the depreciation of third-party cookies mean to other ad tech or martech solutions or trends that you're observing?
Okay, that's a risky one, Emma. I don't have the answer to that, but I'm going to do my best bet here. I mean, my belief on that is that I mean, it's going to be a definitely challenging, because as we were saying, let's say that the whole ad tech industry is based on third-party cookies. So definitely the biggest change is going to be that not having third-party cookies is going to make many solutions shake and many solutions kind of rebuild. I mean, if they want to continue on this business and on this journey, they are going to have to rebuild completely the way they operate to kind of move towards a more, for example, first-party data strategy, and to guarantee that they keep collecting data, which is something like what you are doing, basically, like what you are doing in Nielsen attribution. But for many other companies, I believe that it's going to be very difficult to keep up, even if there's first-party data in the middle. I mean, there are solutions like DMPs or I don't know, retargeting. I don't know what's going to happen to that. Or I believe that there are things that are so dependent on third-party data that I don't see any future for those, honestly, in a scenario in which third-party cookies are not available. So I believe digital is going to be changing drastically, and at the same time, I see that since there are so many walled gardens being built at this point, what I see as well is that once again, data is going to be concentrated and it's going to be accessible, fully accessible by just a few. And the rest of us are going to be just there waiting and seeing how we can access the data if we can. And yeah, that's how I anticipate that. I don't know. It's my best bet right now.
Well, I would love to organize a webinar in a year's time and just look back and see what's actually happened.
Well, yeah, that would be fantastic. I don't know. Yeah, so many things are happening. It's interesting to see how the industry evolves. I believe it's good also for challenges are always good. I mean, in the end, they help you or they push you into changing the way things work. And most likely also, as I was saying during the webinar, this is something that's going to make many platforms grow. I mean, we cannot have a whole industry depending on something that was not built for us in the first place. So yeah, I believe it's going to be a good thing, but at the same time, it's going to be challenging, very challenging to the extent of maybe not existing anymore for many companies or many solutions. So we'll see how that goes for some of them.
Sounds good. I like the note of optimism of transforming the challenge into opportunities for the industry to grow. So I think that sounds really good. And I think we're pretty much at time now. So we hope you found this webinar useful. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. We'll make sure that we answer everything separately. So thank you again so much for your attendance.
Yes, I just want to conclude again by saying this was a real honor for me, like being here with you today. And as Emma said, we are going to reach out to you because we actually had so many other additional questions apart from these ones we just answered. And yeah, we will reach out to you and make sure that all those questions are covered. Thank you so much for taking the time for joining us today, and we'll speak to you soon. Bye.
Bye.